we should just be really clear. The issues that are most likely to tip the suburban, affluent soccer moms, the two-car garage voters outside of Detroit and Milwaukee and Philly and Phoenix and Atlanta, it's not boys playing in girls' sports.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Mike Cosper, Russell Moore, and I sit down with Tim Alberta to discuss the newest political rising star, vice presidential hopeful Tim Walz, and what both parties should expect in the last 90 days of the campaign season. Then David French joins us to talk about Iran's impending attack on Israel, what retaliation to expect, and who might be caught in the crossfire. Welcome to the show. On Tuesday morning, presidential candidate Kamala Harris announced her vice presidential running mate, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota. With just under 90 days until Americans head to the polls, the Harris-Walz ticket now has a lot of ground to cover as they try to win what has been, no doubt, one of the most tempestuous elections in U.S. history. Joining us to talk about this big announcement is journalist, author, and staff writer for The Atlantic, Tim Alberta. Tim, welcome to The Bulletin.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
So Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota entered the spotlight only in the last few weeks as he became a contender for this spot on the Democrats' ticket. Tim, what should we know about him, and why do you think he was chosen over the other expected frontrunners for the job, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona and Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania?
On paper, both Kelly and Shapiro made more sense. They were the consensus frontrunners among Democratic insiders. Folks on Capitol Hill and Democratic operatives around the country were really expecting and hoping that it would be either Mark Kelly, senator from Arizona, or the new and very popular governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, because both of those guys not only represent pivotal battleground states in this election, two of the really 5 or 6 states that are going to wind up deciding who becomes the president, but also because they're much more moderate than Kamala Harris is. They would sort of offset her ideologically in a way that would allow the campaign to continue tacking towards the center, as Kamala Harris herself has endeavored to do since taking over for Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Tim Walz, I think, ultimately wound up being the pick for the basic reason of comfort. I think that Kamala Harris was more comfortable personally with him. I think from all the reporting that we've seen publicly and from what I've heard talking to Democrats myself is that Tim Walz was giving Kamala Harris sort of Joe Biden vibes, the Joe Biden vibes that he gave to Barack Obama circa 2008. There was a level of comfort, a certain understanding that you are being brought in to be the number two, to help the ticket. I think with Josh Shapiro, who was ultimately the runner-up in the Democratic VP contest, Shapiro is younger than Kamala Harris. I think in many ways he's a much more natural politician, a more talented politician than Kamala Harris. I think that there was some concern, frankly, that he might outshine Kamala Harris or upstage her. And so ultimately, I do think that that played a significant role in her decision to go with someone who she felt was going to be a better fit, maybe a more natural fit in that number 2 slot.
Russell, Tim talks about comfort, but do you think that this is the message that's actually being projected to Harris's constituents and to the broader American public in her choice? Or do you think we're getting actually a different message about what her intentions are?
Well, I think there's a completely different message after the rollout than there might have been in the few hours leading up to it, in which people are saying, well, I don't really know this person, what's happening. But then I think after the 2 speeches, the dynamic between the 2 of them, certainly after the Eau Claire event yesterday, I think most people are saying, okay, I can see what it is. Even people who don't support the ticket, who are saying, I can see what it is she's drawn toward. I heard from a lot of people who were very strong Josh Shapiro supporters who said after watching his speech, which was very energetic and strong, but it was focused a lot on kind of coded messages about himself. I love being governor of this state. And so a lot of signals kind of blinking out, wait, I wasn't rejected. I said no. And that really started to rub some people the wrong way. But one of the things I'm curious about that you brought up, Tim, is one of the reports that we're getting is that one of the things that kind of made this decision might have been Shapiro coming in and saying, here are the things that I need in terms of areas of responsibility as vice president. Of course, I mean, going all the way back to Walter Mondale, that's what he did with Jimmy Carter. He's recommended as he would coach other potential vice presidents over the years, make sure that you've got a portfolio, that you've got access. Is that the wrong thing to do now?
In the modern context of presidential campaigning, that would be perceived as an overstepping of bounds by just about anyone, Democrat or Republican, and any operative, anyone who's involved in the machinations of vetting potential vice presidential nominees and then selecting one ultimately. If that person or his team came to you and said, here's the portfolio that I'm looking for, I think that that would be a bit of a red flag. And let's keep in mind that the broader context also. Josh Shapiro is a guy who almost on paper looks to be one of these like presidential candidates grown in a lab. You know, everybody who's known this guy for a long time has known that one day he would be running for president. He's very ambitious, he's very smart, he's very talented. And so at the same time that these reports were coming out around what Shapiro was asking for, you also had the senator, the U.S. senator from his state in his same party, Mr. Fetterman, who was going to Harris's folks and saying, hey, just so you know, look out for this guy. He's sharp-elbowed, he's ambitious. He's not going to be happy as the John Adams style vice president. This is a guy who's going to want a big piece of the pie, and he's going to want a platform, and he's going to want a high profile. And I think that the combination of those two things tells you a lot.
People in the Trump campaign are saying, boy, we're really glad that she picked Walz and not Shapiro because he's a lot easier to run against. There's a lot more of a progressive record. There are things like the 2020 riots. He was the governor when those were taking place. They see an open season there, and they see it as an opportunity to lean more into his progressiveness and her progressiveness from her 2019-2020 efforts. Jonathan Chait said she needs to get comfortable upsetting her progressive base. We've seen some of that already. She's made some moves where she's flip-flopped on fracking and moved away from some of the more radical positions that she held when she was in the presidential primary back then. But I think if she's wanting to reach that middle, you know, with Walz, you have somebody who's got that sort of folksy style that's very appealing, that's very, very broadly appealing. She needs to make some efforts to think about the way they're going to talk about certain policy issues, because I think there's a lot of open territory for attack from the right on those issues if she doesn't.
Speaking of policy issues, after the Dobbs decision, Minnesota enacted some of the most liberal abortion protections in the U.S., including, among other things, a ruling that a 24-hour waiting period and parental notification requirement for minors were unconstitutional. Do you think, Russell, that these stances on hot-button issues will turn off Republican Christians who were maybe thinking that this election might be the one where they were forced to vote Democrat to avoid a Trump-Vance White House?
I don't think so, because what we see happening right now is a widespread cynicism when it comes to those typical sorts of, as you say, hot button for us, for more conservative Christians, issues of abortion and gender and so forth. Right now, we're seeing an American people who are swinging in the opposite direction on all of those issues. Not so much, I think, because they're being persuaded by the positive case for those things, as that they're looking at those who have used Christianity in the other direction and have used it in kind of a cynical way. That actually is fueling and creating a pro-choice ideology and everything else. I mean, you can't really make the case, well, we're the pro-life, pro-family party after your convention just hosted a porn star. And the defense that people have of your gender positions is, well, he may be a rapist, but he does know the difference between a man and a woman. There's not a compelling case coming from the other end that says, here's a holistic vision of why human life matters from conception onward. So I'm not sure that that's going to be as big of an issue in the debate as some people might hope it would be.
Tim, do you sense the same thing for gender-affirming medical care? Minnesota, again, is on the very liberal end of what they are championing there. In fact, they have enacted a law that prevents other states from responding with child protective action for families who desire to bring their child to Minnesota for gender-affirming care.
To Russell's point a minute ago, I really wonder how much of an impact any social issues are going to have in this election, which may be surprising some people to hear me say that. I say it because there is so much noise around these issues now. And I don't think that there is as clear a contrast between the two parties, even on the point about abortion. I mean, for Republicans to have sort of stripped out some of the traditionally pro-life language from their party's platform, to make no mention of, really at all, of the pro-life cause in any of the primetime speeches, any of the 4 nights in Milwaukee, that alone was sort of signaling that not only do Republicans think that this is not a winning issue for them, but I think at the same time it's signaling that they believe that this campaign is going to be fought and ultimately won and lost around the economy, around immigration, around questions that really transcend the very online back and forth around boys playing in girls sports and things like that. It's not to say that they're not important, that those issues aren't important. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that I think voters have become desensitized to them in a way over these last couple of election cycles. We've seen some signs of that. I've gone out canvassing with Republicans and with Democrats, the issues that are resonating with voters, the issues that are really mobilizing voters. And ultimately, we should just be really clear, the issues that are most likely to tip the suburban, affluent soccer moms, the 2-car garage voters outside of Detroit and Milwaukee and Philly and Phoenix and Atlanta, it's not boys playing in girls sports. It's just not. It's ultimately going to be questions of inflation, questions of crime, locally, nationally, immigration, can the border get fixed, things like that. So I think Republicans are going to make hay of Tim Walz's progressive record, and I think for very high information voters, that's going to matter. But most voters who decide elections are not super high information. They're sort of medium to low information, and they're just looking at sort of top line stances. They're not going to be dumpster diving on how Tim Walz feels about, some of the culture war issues that a lot of our readers may care about.
Well, and over the past couple of days, even some of the most salient of those issues are pretty much off the table. I mean, the 2020 George Floyd riots that Mike mentioned, ABC News now has audio of Donald Trump at the time saying, Tim Walz handling, this is the way you do it. This guy was tough. He's sending in the National Guard. And the conversation has been over the past several days, not that, but really ridiculous kinds of quibbles about his National Guard record, when he retired. And I saw this morning that he said he was coach when he was assistant coach, when he took the team to the championship. I mean, you got to get stronger than that if you're going to actually make traction, especially when you're having those kinds of crowds showing up in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
The one thing that I would say, though, is I think all of that makes perfect sense to me and is right on. The only problem, though, is that the Democrats can shoot themselves in the foot on these issues by behaving stupidly around them. Is the election going to turn on transgender athletes in women's sports? Probably not. But if the campaign decides to make that an issue, if there's a campaign appearance with Leah Thomas, if there's a campaign ad with Dylan Mulvaney, if they kind of lean into that very sort of young, woke, super online thing and start working to win the trans rights activist vote, if they start to treat that constituency as something that they have to really, really win, the right will make hay out of that, and it'll turn off people.
I half agree with you. I think they can do that. If they decided to do that, they definitely can turn off people who are, come on, we're not going to move into, should you declare your pronouns every time you walk into the grocery store? That would turn people off. I don't see any evidence yet that they want to do that. But if they did, I don't think that the Republicans are going to be able to make that a factor with swing voters. I mean, you just look at where that has been tried, where
Right.
people have said, oh, we come in and we deal with the trans bathroom issue, whatever somebody thinks of that.
It would have to be an unforced error,
Yeah.
right? Like it would
Yeah.
have to be them making some initiative, making some big effort that creates the doorway. And something Jonah Goldberg has been saying since 2016, the problem with our politics right now is that the Republicans are crazy and the Democrats are stupid. I don't want to underestimate the capacity of the Democrats to shoot themselves in the foot in a moment like this with a winnable election.
And I would add to that, let's be really clear. Kamala Harris has, since running for president herself in 2020, shown some really bad political instincts. This is where staffing becomes really important. So we've seen in the last week to 10 days that a number of Obama veterans have come in to sort of, I don't want to say push out the old Harris regime, but certainly there's been a little bit of a changing of the guard. You've brought in some people who understand how to run a campaign that is not super online, that is not targeted towards the non-existent voters who are mobilized around Kamala Harris doing drag queen events or whatever, right? Like there's an understanding, I think, among smart Democrats who want to win this election that they have already maxed out the Dylan Mulvaney vote. Like there is nothing left for them to gain by courting the sort of hard left of the progressive base of the party. And that's what Harris did throughout her 2020 campaign. It hurt her. It's continued to hurt her. I don't know if you've seen some of the web ads that have already been released, like by Dave McCormick, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania. She took a number of stances that just weren't even necessary for her to take. So I think that she has begun, to your point earlier, Mike, to walk some of those back and really, in some cases, just plain out flip-flop on those things. That's an early hint that she's gotten the message from people in her party that if you're going to win this election, you can't be running hard towards the left. You have to be tacking back towards the center in your messaging and in your policy positions.
As James Carville says famously, there aren't enough votes in the Amherst faculty lounge to win the election.
That's right.
Tim, do you see the Republican Party changing their tack as they watch these things happen in the Democratic Party? I saw one Republican quoted as saying, "I would stick to the price of groceries," when he was talking about encouragement for Donald Trump to stick to his messaging instead of taking pot shots, perhaps, at the enemy. Do you think that strategy changes are going to happen in the next 90 days, or do you think we'll see more of the same from the Republicans?
I published a long piece about a month ago or so in The Atlantic talking about how the Trump campaign was really in control of this race because they had built their entire campaign operationally and mechanically around running against Joe Biden. This is exactly why they worried about him getting out of the race, because not only does it screw with their tactics and with their strategy and with their ground game implementation, all those sorts of things, but fundamentally, it takes Donald Trump back to the drawing board psychologically. Like it forces him to rethink the ways that he's going to attack his opponent. So Donald Trump had been very comfortable running against an old, feeble, clearly diminished Joe Biden. And there was really not a whole lot he could say or do in attacking Joe Biden that was going to antagonize or offend broad swaths of the American electorate. Fast forward to Kamala Harris being atop the ticket, and within days, he's talking about her race and questioning, is she really black? This is the sort of thing that has Republicans pulling their hair out because they had a sort of settled path that they were on and a macro approach to winning this election that was working for them. And now they don't. That much is clear. That's not to say they won't win. I would still put them as a slight betting favorite to win, but I think it's very clear that Donald Trump doesn't know how to run against Kamala Harris, except to say that she's the most progressive presidential candidate in history, which may be true. It probably is true. But he has to figure out, and his campaign has to figure out a way for him to get back to a disciplined nuts and bolts messaging around the price of gas, around the price of milk, around the price of eggs, and even I would argue around some of the other issues that are salient in this race, like immigration, which I've mentioned several times. We see every focus group, every poll coming back showing that immigration resonates with voters. But if Trump can't stick to that core set of issues, and there's obviously a lot of history to suggest that he can't because he's just not disciplined enough, then I think that's trouble for Republicans up and down the ballot.
Russell, if someone is listening to the news and they're just ready to throw their hands up, they say, it's 90 days to go and I'm done with this bumpy ride. I don't even know if I'm going to show up in November to vote. What would you say to that person to encourage them to persevere over the next 3 months?
Well, it depends on what we mean by persevere. If I'm not somebody who would bind that person's conscience to say, you have to vote, I think that there are all kinds of people who conscientiously object to voting. I'm not going to bind your conscience on that. If what we mean by persevere is survive through the end of the presidential election, then I would say, well, yeah, buckle up, because the massive changes that we have seen over the last month. I mean, imagine our conversation about the stuff we're talking about today, June the 28th, just a few weeks ago. It's going to be that way from now until November, and possibly could be that way for 4 years after that. That's the kind of world that we're living in right now. I would just say, if you're the kind of person who's thrown by that kind of uncertainty, spend some time on the things that are actually stable. I mean, spend some time in Hebrews 12 and 13 and think about the things that can't be shaken, because everything else is going to be a little unstable for quite a while.
There's a certain steadiness that can be found when we realize that our hope doesn't depend on the person who occupies the Oval Office, but instead rests securely in the one who sits at the right hand of God, ruling in justice and righteousness. Tim, thanks for being with us. Listeners, as you anticipate holding a ballot in your hand, read carefully, engage lovingly, and fix your eyes on Jesus. We will be right back. Last week, top Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Iran while there to attend the inauguration of Iran's new president. And a top Hezbollah leader was killed by Israeli forces in Lebanon. Iran, the backer of both militant groups, has vowed to retaliate. As the world waits on edge to see what this retaliation might look like, Hamas is moving forward to establish new leadership. On Tuesday, it was announced that Yahya Sinwar, one of the architects of the October 7th attack on Israel, will now head the organization's political wing. There are many unknowns as we wait to see how Iran and Israel will respond, how Israel will defend itself, and how the ripple effects of this widening conflict will affect the whole region. What we do know for sure, however, is that for centuries, Christians have also called this land their home. Last week, we began this conversation in episode 97 when we talked with Haviv Gur, and I commend that episode to you. And as we wait to see countries make their next moves, we wanted to continue that conversation today more specifically. Joining us to talk about Iran and Israel with a special focus on our brothers and sisters in Christ who live in that region is our good friend, David French, New York Times columnist. David, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Israel has killed other militant leaders before. Why do you think these two deaths in particular are going to provoke a powerful response from Iran? Is there something unique about these two characters, or is this conflict that's just now coming to a head?
The way this happened, the stature of the person assassinated, the depth of the penetration through the Iranian security apparatus, this makes it a whole different ballgame, because the reporting indicates that there was a bomb placed in this guest house months ago. So think about what had to happen here as far as penetration deep into the heart of Iranian security, deep into the heart of the Iranian regime. So Hamas didn't just take a loss when its political leader was assassinated. Iran was deeply humiliated. And it also at the same time had to be deeply worried, because why would they think that Israel was only able to penetrate security to get this one guy? If they could penetrate that deeply, who couldn't they reach? And so you have a humiliation for Iran. You have a defeat for Hamas. You have reason for Iran to feel as if they can't be secure. The senior leaders can't be secure. So all of that adds up to something orders of magnitude sort of more dramatic than your typical assassination. And Israel, to be clear, has been very good at this for a very long time, at taking out terrorist leaders wherever they are. And there have been attacks or assassinations in Iran before. But this was something else, both in the stature of the person, the deep penetration of the Iranian security establishment, the vulnerability that Iran should naturally feel after something like this. So there are a lot of reasons to both think that Iran wants to lash out, and also to think that Iran knows if it lashes out, that it could very quickly pay a price it may not be willing to pay. And so there's a lot going on here.
And right on the tails of this, Russell, Yahya Sinwar is rising to a new elevated presence. What kind of message is Iran trying to send with his ascension now as a primary Hamas leader?
Well, it's hard to tell how much is saber rattling, how much is face saving, as David just mentioned. I mean, it's easy for us when we're looking at these big geopolitical sorts of conflicts to think of it in terms that transcend human nature, when often we're dealing with the same dynamic one might see in a middle school lunchroom. I've been insulted, I've lost face, I've got to gain face, except that the stakes are high in terms of how am I going to continue to maintain my power in the whole equilibrium here. So it's very, very hard to say, because any wrong turn at this point could set off a series of actions. We don't know where all of that leads. And the interesting thing about all of that is that they know that too. I mean, I think almost everybody involved in this knows that as well. And that's what leads to a great deal of uncertainty here. So even in the signals that are being sent, Iran saying, for instance, today, before we came on, we don't want commercial aircraft in our area because of potential military exercises. Is that just saber rattling, or is that actually preparing for some action? We don't know.
Mike, what do you expect we will see on the northern border and then in Gaza in the next couple of days as Iran and Israel do this posturing?
The reporting that we're seeing this morning is actually pretty interesting, because it's looking like there's been a lot of back channel communication and pressure on Iran not to do the big grand response. And there is some reporting that's saying that Iran is kind of second guessing whether or not this is the time to do it, the moment to do it. At the same time that reporting is coming out, you're hearing more noise from Hezbollah, more potential for aggression from Hezbollah. In fact, there was one report saying that we're going to strike first. We're going to strike before Iran does. And that actually plays into something that Haviv Gur said last week about the conflict, which was that Iran is prepared to fight this fight to the last dead Arab. They're happy to have a massive war take place between Hezbollah and Israel because they can pretty much sit that one out. But if the threats coming from Israel are, look, if you do this to us again, we're going to destroy your oil fields, we're going to destroy your ports, we have the capacity to do it, and we have the backup of the U.S., who has sent ships, and there's planes on the way, and there's a pretty significant backup that's being put in place or been put in place in the last few days, then it might make sense that we would see Iran just primarily use proxies and hope that Israel would only respond directly to the proxies and not respond directly to Iran. The other thing that's happening right now is that Israel's got a lot of trouble at home. Israel's right wing is acting crazy, getting crazier. There was a massive riot at a prison where a number of IDF soldiers were being arrested for the abuse of prisoners that are attached to some of these right-wing parties. That turned into a massive problem. And then yesterday, a minister that's a part of Bibi Netanyahu's cabinet, a guy named Bezalel Smotrich, came out and said that, hey, it's a reasonable thing to put on the table that we should just now starve Gaza. Something that Israel has been saying very aggressively, post November or so. There was some saber rattling in October that was ugly around this idea. But Israel has been saying very loudly, Bibi made a point in his speech to Congress a few weeks ago of saying, we are feeding Gaza, we are feeding Palestinians, we are being humane. So something like this just creates enormous problems internally, it creates enormous problems diplomatically and internationally. It's just a very, very unstable and unpredictable moment, I think.
David, I want to go back to something that Mike mentioned about Israel's capacity to retaliate. They can't fight alone for very long. And I wonder, will the United States be drawn further into this conflict? Are we going to need to step forward to take out Iran's nuclear capacities, for example? I can imagine Americans being perhaps comfortable with warships in the Mediterranean, but are we going to have boots on the ground to actually solve what's going on here?
I think boots on the ground is very, very, very doubtful. I think one of the reasons why you're seeing what Mike referenced to, sort of a ring around parts of the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, if you look at a map of U.S. ship deployments right now, it does look like a ring of ships around the region. One of the reasons why we have that is to try to avoid the worst case scenario. So remember when Israel assassinated an IRGC leader several months ago, and Iran responded with a big missile barrage. Now, we shouldn't underestimate what Iran did. It was a big attack. Just to put it in perspective, if you had translated that Iran attack into Russia-Ukraine terms, sort of where, the biggest war in the world right now is Russia-Ukraine, that would have been a very big attack, even by Russian standards, in that war. So this was a big attack made against Israel. And Israel, with American and British and Jordanian help, repelled it almost completely. It was very embarrassing for Iran. That was not just a symbolic attack. They sent the kitchen sink. And so then Israel follows up with a precision strike in Iran that wasn't that destructive, but sent a message, which was, you sent your weapons and you couldn't hit us, and we hit you easily in response. And then Israel just assassinated somebody in the heart of Tehran, in a VIP guest quarters. And so there's an interesting calculus here where the combination of American force, the success of the previous Israeli defense, is sort of weighing heavily on this. And so the Americans want to be able to repel an attack so that missiles don't get through, kill Israeli civilians, and then dramatically escalate all of this. That's the goal, to intervene on behalf of Israel in a sheer defense capacity to prevent missiles getting through, so that it leaves options. I said this in an interview very recently with some Israeli journalists. I said, the difference between a good defense and no defense is the difference between stopping October 7th and October 7th happening. If October 7th had been stopped, we live in a different world. It's just a different world. The fact that the October 7th attack got through Israeli defenses is what escalated this so dramatically. This is why deterrence matters. This is why defense matters. So there's a reason why Hezbollah is rattling its saber. Hezbollah can get through. Hezbollah has enough missiles, has enough rockets, it just has enough ordnance that it can overwhelm Israeli defenses. At the same time, Hezbollah is right there next to Israel. And so Israel can reach out and touch it instantly, immediately, with massive force. So right now, the dynamic, though, is also, a lot of reporting indicates IDF doesn't want to fight a northern war right now. It's had 10 months of conflict in Gaza. The Israeli army and Israeli military is heavily dependent on reserves. It's not huge. And so it has to rest and has to refit before it goes back into an even tougher fight with Hezbollah. But I don't see American boots on the ground unless there's some sort of peace or truce or ceasefire agreement where we're peacekeepers, because quite frankly, we're not needed. Israel has the capacity to deal with Hezbollah. Israel can do it. The question is, does Hezbollah want to court that kind of conflict? Does Israel want to engage in that kind of conflict? All of that is just up in the air, and all of that depends greatly on how successful Israel and its allies are in defending against this retaliation. If they're successful in defending, it gives options. If the defense fails and a lot of Israeli civilians are killed, then the ball drops, the war really gets going on the northern border, and we're just in a different kind of environment.
Well, speaking about allies, the Arab Barometer, which is Foreign Affairs' nonpartisan research arm, reported in a recent study that China has been the primary beneficiary of the United States' decline in reputation among Arab publics. While it seems that most countries surveyed simply dislike U.S. politics right now, Russell, it almost feels as though Russia and China are waiting in the wings here for an opportunity. Should we be concerned about that?
Well, yes, and not just in the Middle East. Russia and China are engaged in an ongoing propaganda war. They want to see every bit of chaos that can possibly happen with the United States' reputation being diminished. They would love to see the United States involved in some sort of foreign policy failure that would prevent us then from being involved with Ukraine, with potential invasion of Taiwan. And there's all sorts of mischief making happening right now. If you think about particularly Ann Applebaum's new book, Autocracy Incorporated, talks about how these authoritarian regimes have changed the way that they do propaganda because they have learned those kinds of symbolic efforts from Tiananmen Square and the Czech uprising and other things that they can combat with counter propaganda that leads to a sort of civil death for those who would stand against them. This sort of mischief making in every possible way, from social media all the way over to more traditional channels of propaganda, yeah, that's going to continue. The thing, though, that makes me optimistic about that is, historically speaking, the United States has been pretty good at countering authoritarian propaganda. I mean, we created Radio Free Europe and other sorts of ways of countering it. We're going to have to be good at it again.
Mike, a decade ago, there were an estimated 10 to 15 million Christians who were living in the Arab world, but that number has significantly decreased over the last decade. Syria, for example, a home to some of the world's oldest churches, has seen its Christian population decimated, going from approximately 2 million people to just 300,000 believers left. We know that the Palestinian church and the church in Lebanon are very small. Talk to us about life as a believer in these places that, as Russell says, are authoritarian, in Gaza, the West Bank, in Beirut, in Tehran. What is Christian life like for people who live there?
It's contested, and it depends on sort of what's happening in the regime at the time. I mean, the Syrian Christians who were living in Syria a decade ago, they lived there for a couple thousand years before the conditions around the civil war. And before that, in certain areas, the other reason that you saw a decline in the population was the rise of ISIS. The rise of ISIS drove a lot of Christians out of Iraq and out of Syria. You have different situations in the West Bank where Christians are experiencing a certain kind of pressure from Fatah, and Christians in Gaza who are living under Hamas, which is much more of a kind of totalitarian, much more openly hostile. In the West Bank, Fatah and the PA, they're interested in having Christian allies as part of their own political machine. But the shrinking of the Christian population in Gaza is one of those stories that's a tragedy that's not even fully told in terms of what Hamas has done there, because life in there is hard to report on. It's an incredibly difficult situation. And one of the things that you find when you hear the stories of Christians who get out is a sense of injustice, a sense that their story isn't being told. I've heard a lot of that, especially from Syrian and Lebanese Christians who, either because of Hezbollah or because of the civil war, feel like this has happened to us. We're being displaced. We're being ethnically cleansed. There is a genocidal effort against us in certain places, and no one cares.
When we hear talk of being a Christian in an authoritarian state, I automatically think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a person who spoke loudly against evil political forces. Russell, I wonder, though, are we all called to be Dietrich Bonhoeffers? Should we place that kind of expectation on folks who are living in these parts of the world where it is extremely difficult and complex to be a Christian?
Well, we're all called to be Dietrich Bonhoeffers if what we mean by that is having a conscience that is shaped in such a way as to be able to withstand conformity to the pattern of the world around us, Romans chapter 12, in order to present ourselves as living sacrifices for Christ. That looks different for different people in different contexts. And you can see that even throughout Scripture. You can see that in the case of Daniel in one figure who is responding differently to the Babylonian and then later Persian regime, responding differently as the stakes become higher for him in terms of his own conscience and his own obedience to God. So it's not simple for anybody to know, here's how I should protest against authoritarian, anti-God sorts of responses to human dignity, but it is the case that we have to do that. One of the reasons that Bonhoeffer emphasized the fact that we need each other has to happen in terms of life in community to know which part of the body should respond in which way at which time. That's not always simple.
There's a complicator here in this as well, and that is that if you look at rising Islamic fundamentalism of the last several decades, in many ways it was the horrible strongmen who were protecting the Christian community. So this was a little bit of a different kind of situation than, say, the Bonhoeffer and Hitler. And one of the issues is that it was Ba'athist dictators, for example, and to an extent Saddam Hussein, Bashar al-Assad, and others who had kind of sheltered some of the Christian community. And so one of the negative effects of deposing Saddam Hussein was actually then his umbrella of protection was sort of lifted, and the Christian community in Iraq suffered terribly during the Iraq War. And this was not an anticipated consequence of deposing Hussein, was this idea that then it would expose the Christian community to persecution at such a scale. But it is an odd situation in the Middle East where the removal of these strongmen dictators makes the Christian community more vulnerable. And so you would often see this argument over, for example, intervention in Syria during the Obama administration. Don't intervene. Assad is protecting Christians. Well, Assad's a monster. And so this is another one of those reasons why the Middle East is so mind-bendingly complicated. It is often very difficult to sort of find the clear path through that doesn't have catastrophic consequences one way or the other for a community that you care about. It's just such a difficult knot to untie.
Mike, as a religion journalist, this must be really difficult to report on then.
One of the things that I did encounter being in the West Bank right after October the 7th was the extraordinary difficulty and the tensions that Christians felt, again, living in the West Bank in the situation that they were in. There's a real difference between what happens on the mic and what happens over tea after the recording is finished. And some of that is about what's safe and what isn't safe to say. And at the same time, in that particular situation, there's also no doubt that the Palestinian Christians experience a certain amount of hardship because of the ongoing conflict with Israel. And so they feel a kinship with their Arab Muslim neighbors. And it is incredibly difficult. And you see similar dynamics with Christians who leave other countries and other areas because they have family back home. They're not eager to raise the levels of hostility, to raise the alarm, to raise the scrutiny that their family members, that their communities are experiencing in the places that they've left either.
Many of those fleeing from oppressive governments and military conflict have come here to the U.S. I went ahead and Googled, and there are 3 Syriac churches and 3 Egyptian Coptic churches within just an hour's drive of me here in the Boston area. That's 6 expat churches in the Arab world, just a stone's throw away. And I can't help but think about how my Christian witness, as someone who is engaged in conversation about politics, falls on the ears of those Christians. Russell, what do you think should mark our discourse with our Middle Eastern brothers and sisters in Christ and with one another so that we can love them well as neighbors here in the U.S.?
We have to realize that we're part of a body of Christ that's bigger than just our nation states. I mean, that's one of the truly radical things coming out of Pentecost, is that we belong to each other. And one of the things that we see happening really, really early on, Book of Hebrews, for instance, think about the persecution of your brothers and sisters around the world, so that when one part of the body hurts, the rest of the body hurts as well. There can be that even when we're not exactly sure what the particular geopolitical answers should be to that suffering, or where we might even disagree on where those answers should be. We can still love each other and see this as being my problem too, not just yours.
Well, as we wait to hear what comes next between Iran and Israel, we are reminded of how much we long for the return of our Prince of Peace and for that holy city wherein the tree of life bears leaves that heal the nations. David, thanks for joining us in conversation today. Listeners, thanks for being with us. We will see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.